Mr. Chairman and members, thank you all for hearing this bill. I know it's been a long day. But I also want to say thanks to the people who came here to testify either for or against this bill, for their patience and their perseverance also, because they've been here waiting, and they waited patiently, and I just wanted to tell them thank you, and that's for all of the bills that are left to be heard. This is a bill that I filed since 2003. In 2003, I decided that as a legislator, I didn't want Texas executing anybody in my name. And as a member of the Texas House of Representatives, that's essentially what they were doing. And I did that because I had an opportunity to go visit death row. I went for another mission. The law says that if you're serving time for a conviction and that conviction is on appeal, you still maintain your right to vote. And so I decided I would go to death row, where most everybody there was on appeal, and register them to vote. And I did that. I went through all 3 levels of death row, registering the qualified inmates to vote, but I didn't realize what effect it would have on me. Because when I got home, I sat in the house in the dark trying to figure out what was wrong, and I realized what had happened is I had just been through a situation where I looked in over 200 men's eyes, and I knew at that point that the state was going to kill them. And that bothered me. And what bothered me more is that what I realized also is that Texas's criminal justice system was not able to prevent you from being arrested if you're not guilty, tried if you're not guilty, sentenced if you're not guilty, and then incarcerated if you're not guilty, and more especially sentenced to death and you're not guilty. And so for Texas, it meant to me that you could be factually innocent in Texas and found legally guilty, which means that you could be factually innocent of the crime for which you were arrested, you were tried, you were found guilty of, and you were sentenced to death for. And that bothered me, because I knew our system wasn't perfect. In fact, what I did is I asked several members at the time, tell me a government program that you think is broken. Give me an idea of a government program that you think is broken. Nobody ever talked about the criminal justice system. Not one of them ever mentioned it, because they didn't think of it as a government program. And yet, for most of us, we would look at a government program and say they all need fixing. This is one that I think needs fixing. And so the way I was going to fix it, members and Mr. Chairman, is to do what 30 other states have done. They have abandoned the death penalty in this country because they recognize, number one, that the system that we have is so imperfect that it just doesn't justify us doing what some of us find objectionable, and that is executing somebody. And so whenever anybody gets executed, it's because the legislature didn't change the statute so they could be prevented from being executed, which means they execute them in the name of Barbara Gervin Hawkins. They execute them in the names of Mr. Hefner, Mr. Lang, Mr. Wilson, and Chairman Moody, and Chairman Hunter. That's whose names they execute them in. And so for me, I decided that I needed to do something about it. And what I decided to do was I decided that I would sponsor this bill, Mr. Chairman and members. And what this bill does, this bill eliminates the death penalty in Texas and says that Texas will no longer be looked at as one of the states where people who have committed, and some of them have committed some of the most heinous of crimes, and some of them didn't. One of the things we know now is that, I don't remember the number, but there have been a number of people who have been exonerated who are on death row in Texas. And yet, it didn't leave me any comfort in knowing that. The one case that always bothered me was Clarence Brantley. Like I said, I happen to know him. I happen to know him because he was convicted of having committed a murder of a young female in Conroe, Texas. And they sentenced him to murder. They sentenced him to death because of the murder. Only later to find out that he was not only not guilty, he was factually not guilty. And yet, when you read, if you'd like to read something that will make the hair stand up on your arms, read his the eloquence of the judge who finally decided that justice needed to be served by letting Clarence off death row. Read it sometimes. I would suggest to you, Mr. Chairman and members, that this is a bill that I can tell you that when I was asked this morning at the press conference, are we going to have to be here next session? I told them that the same thing I will tell you. If Texas doesn't get it right, I think we have an obligation to come back over and over and over again. And so with that, Mr. Chairman and members, let me stop and ask if there are any questions. I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, Chairman Dutton. Do I have any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank
I
you.
will reserve the right to close. And